Greetings, everybody. This is Mox Diamond, and welcome to CCG Case Study, where we analyze cards from various card games and explore connections between them to attempt to make us all better players. Today, we're going to look at how we can shape our opponent's choices to best suit our needs, and the value of losing cards, with a key focus on one Magic the Gathering card in particular. Class is in session, so let's go. Gifts Ungiven was released in the Champions of Kamigawa set in October 2004, and it was actually a fixed version of Intuition, a card that was released with the set Tempest in October 1997. Pretty quickly after Intuition was released, players realized they could just guarantee they got whatever card they wanted from their deck, assuming that they ran at least 3 copies of that card and they had the 3 copies of that card in their deck. The play team at Wizards had intended that the card was going to be an interesting mental game. You selected 3 different cards and your opponent had to figure out which one was most important to you, but it turned out they just forgot to add the word different cards to the text, and that made it into a completely different beast. It's no longer a mental game, it's now just literally a tutor. You get to search your deck for a card as long as you run more than 3 copies of it. Intuition has seen quite a bit of competitive play. For example, on the left here, we have from January 2011, this is a Sneak and Show deck that plays Intuition as a tutor for it. And then on the right, we've also got a Legacy Intuition Loam deck that was from December 12th, 2009. On the left one, it's using it mostly as a tutor. You're just searching for your Show and Tells, Sneak Attacks, or your Emrakul / Progenitus, whichever one you're trying to get into play. Occasionally, you may use it to try to search for 3 Force of Wills to back up your combo. And on the right, commonly what you're going to probably use it for is search for Life from the Loam and then some combination of other tools depending on the matchup. We'll talk a little bit more about these types of piles when we get into our gifts piles later on, but you could also search for Life from the Loam and then just like a Wasteland and a fetch land, and you now can either lock your opponent out of the game or can continue getting lands every turn. So it's pretty useful. However, this is different purposes for the most part than Gifts is. Gifts itself has seen reasonable success since its release in multiple formats. It's banned in Commander in June 2009. It's been pretty useful in other formats, including Standard, but we're not really going to be looking at Standard a lot today. One note I did find upon looking at some of the Standard stuff is them talking about when it was originally released, because you separate the cards into 2 piles. You click 2. People might misinterpret on Magic Online especially what cards were in what pile, and so they'd go, okay, I'm going to choose these 2 cards, and then it would accidentally go into the hand, and they didn't realize they'd selected the cards to go to the graveyard. They thought they selected the cards that would go to the player. Which is, again, it's a technical error instead of an actual play error, but that's the world we live in, especially with the state of MTG Arena right now too. In June 2009, though, Gifts was restricted to 1 copy in Vintage, and we'll talk more about its uses in Vintage a little bit later on. But Vintage is the highest power format in Magic, so it still saw some play as a card advantage generating control card, but really it was used for some other things. It did become unrestricted in January 2015 to no real success. It didn't break the format or anything like that. The most notable uses of Gifts since then have been in Modern, where various Storm currently and previously Control decks continue to use it, even to this day. So now that we've acquainted with our subject, let's dive into our analysis of why these cards are so powerful. Let's try to mentally work our way from the lowest experience level of use to the most advanced uses of the card. Okay, so for how do we use this, like I said, we're going to start at level 0, and we're going to work our way up and get to some more complex trains of thought that we can go from there. For level 0, I can get 4 awesome cards, and my opponent has to give me 2 of them. This is probably the first stage of thought that many players would think. A casual player might go hey, I can make a control deck, and I can just pick 4 gigantic, awesome monsters. These are my win conditions, and then I could play Gifts, and I will always get 2 of them. Even if I'm getting the worst of the 2, which I know that these 2 might not necessarily be the worst of the 2, it would be situational. But even if I get the worst of the 2, I'm still getting 2 gigantic monsters. The problem with this level of thinking is that now you're limiting yourself in the usage of this card. If your gifts is going to be the search for the same 4 cards every time, what would happen if you drew your second gifts? Or, hypothetically, if you're playing 4 gifts and 4 different card-named finishers, why wouldn't you just play a 4-4 split or a 3-3 of whichever 2 are the best ones? That guarantees that you'll always have a threat, and you didn't have to spend a 4-mana investment in the first place. Your opponent will always give you the option that they have the highest chance of beating, so you may never even see whichever win condition you think is your best one, if you only ever get to put one into a gifts pile. All right, on from level 0. We're at level 1 now. Instead of just thinking, I'm going to search for my 4 gigantic monsters and then I'll have my win condition. Awesome. Now let's think of it as, well, I have a card that can make my opponent have to figure out what I need. This was the intention whenever they designed the card, Intuition, and they kind of tried to fix it into Gifts Ungiven. So instead of just always getting your massive threat, maybe I can just get a few different cards, and maybe I can prevent my player from knowing, or my opponent from knowing what I want. Maybe if I gifts for Hinder, Kodama's Reach, a Rend Flesh, and hey, if I'm ever stuck and don't know what else to get, I can always just put another gifts in the pile. In a situation like this, you're presenting a question to your opponent. Do you know what I need? Especially if you do this on your turn 4, like you pass, your opponent takes their turn, and at the end of their turn, you gifts for these 4 cards, you're really making them have to figure out what is important in this pile. Do you need the lands from Kodama's Reach? Do you only have 4 lands, and you're trying to get to 6 to cast your Kakusho, if we're sticking within the Champions of Kamigawa block theme? Would that be the only counter spell they would have access to? If I don't give them Hinder, are they not going to be able to counter any of my spells? Well, if I give them Rend Flesh, they can kill my big creature that I'm about to play, but if I give them Hinder, they can just counter that creature, so I kind of don't want to give them that. But what if I'm giving them the lands so they can just play a bigger threat? And if I give them gifts, I'm just giving them a chance to ask me this question again. I'm just going to keep having to deal with this problem. So now we're using gifts to play some level of mind games, because if you're building a deck that has these cards as an option, as well as your bomb threats, you can search for your bomb threats if you're just needing to win the game, and if you aren't going to just be winning the game soon, you can search for cards like this. The realization that you can also gifts for another gifts is huge in formats where it isn't restricted, at least. So you couldn't do this in Vintage previously. But this is the point many realize that with some clever deck building, you can also make it so if you're tight on mana, you can actually also just gifts for 4 lands. Instead of needing to hope that they give you the Kodama's Reach, even in a mono blue deck, you have plenty of non-basic land options that you could put in your deck that won't necessarily completely ruin whatever your game plan is. And this means that you can gifts for 4 lands, and you can just always search for 2 lands and put them into your hand. So this makes gifts even more useful than it already was. Okay, you might be saying, that's all well and good. I can try to play mind games with my opponents, but what if I actually need a specific card or a specific type of card? Well, for level 2, with smart deck building, you can create a toolbox that will always get you the type of card you need, even if it isn't exactly what you're wanting. One of the previous ideas we brought up was to gifts for 4 lands when you need to hit your land drops. What if instead of needing land drops, you needed some sort of wrath effect, something that you could use to kill all of your opponent's creatures? Well, we can possibly try to fill our deck with redundant cards that will allow us to gifts for these effects. This is the idea behind gifts usage in modern control decks. Again, when I say modern, I'm not talking about like in the current day, I'm talking about the format modern, where you fill your deck with 1-ofs or 2-ofs, cards that have similar functionalities. For example, instead of playing 4 Supreme Verdicts, which would not allow you to search for a wrath effect if you only played these 4, you can instead put in your deck Supreme Verdict, Day of Judgment, Wrath of God, and Shatter to the Sky. Now, in this case, you're probably going to get Day of Judgment, Shatter to the Sky every time because they are slightly the worst out of all of them. But functionality-wise, you're still getting 4 mana, 2 cards that will destroy all creatures. No matter what, it's not an option. You can get away with playing 3 versions of an effect if you find out you only need 1 of them when you gifts for it. Now, anecdotally, I did play 3 to 5 color gifts for a short while in Modern, so I do know a little bit about it. And I'll walk you through a couple of the lines of things that I used to be able to gifts for in that deck. So if you're playing against a combo deck, You might gifts for a Remand, a Mana Leak, a Counter Squall, and a Logic Knot. This way, no matter what, you've got some kind of interaction. Usually in this case, I probably was getting Remand Counter Squall, unless they were a straight-up non-creature deck and had absolutely no creatures to deal with in their decks whatsoever, which case I would usually get Logic Knot. But this pile gives me at least 2 counter spells that I will be able to use against the combo deck. Against more aggressive decks, you would gifts for Path to Exile, Go for the Throat, Slaughter Pact, and recent days Fatal Push, or in more recent days Fatal Push. This way, no matter what, for 4 mana, you are getting 2 spells that for little to no mana will be able to interact with a creature. And if you're going against a control deck, my personal favorite pile that I think I've probably piled for the most just because I really like the value, is you can gifts for a Lingering Souls, a Think Twice, a Gifts Ungiven, and a Snapcaster Mage. Now this pile gives you a lot of card advantage for 4 mana. You can also start to see here that when we have cards that have an effect in the graveyard, like our Lingering Souls and our Think Twice, or that can use something from our graveyard like Snapcaster Mage, actually not getting the cards is a valuable thing. Getting the cards is good, but also not getting the cards provides you at least some sort of benefit. This is the core idea of the current iteration of Gift Storm as well, where not getting the cards is actually okay. So this is actually a fairly recent list. This is from July 31st, 2020, and this is a Gift Storm deck. And the whole idea is that you're going to use mana reduction effects like Goblin Electromancer and Baral, Chief of Compliance. And then you're going to cast things like Manamorphose, Desperate Ritual, and eventually you're going to chain those filtering effects and that ritual effects into Gifts Ungiven, which will then get you cards, some to your hand and some to the graveyard. You can then continue casting more rituals and casting more effects, eventually putting Past in Flames in the graveyard, and then once Past in Flames is in the graveyard, you can cast 1 or sometimes 2, maybe if you're unlucky, 3 Grape Shots. Usually it's in the 2 range is probably the most common combination of Grape Shots, though. So this is where planning your deck construction is a really huge part of playing Gifts Ungiven. Our Gifts has gone from a 4-mana tutor where we just find our bomb cards every time to a way we can have, a thing where we can make our opponent have to figure out what we're doing. And now it's a 4-mana card that if you build your deck right, you can actually get any card that you need, even if it's not exactly the same. You'll also notice that Snapcaster Mage and Past in Flames get to act as almost wild cards. If we select Past in Flames in our pile, we either will get it in our hand, and we can cast spells from our graveyard, or into the graveyard, where it can be flashed back. And if we're given Snapcaster Mage, we get to pick any instant or sorcery we want from our graveyard, without giving them the choice. We could even get back a card they threw away during our gifts, or cast gifts again. Hey, that seems like a really cool interaction. The fact that we can, get any card we want out of it. What if we push that even further? What if instead of, trying to just get a specific type of card, we make even smarter deck building choices and we make it so we can get the card we want every time, no matter what. Instead of just making sure we have redundant copies, we can use cards that get cards back into our hand or allow us to recast cards from our graveyard. The first time I ever was exposed to this situation was when I was in a vintage tournament and I saw a player get the following gifts pile: Time Vault, Voltaic Key, Eternal Witness, Regrowth. You now have a pile where the best thing that your opponent can do is delay you getting the cards that you searched for a turn or 2, depending on how much mana you have. You could also swap out Time Vault and Voltaic Key for whatever 2-card combos you want. This is just the default 2-card vintage I win combo, where you just take infinite turns and it doesn't really matter what you do. And in some cases, giving them Eternal Witness might actually be a detriment, because if you give them Eternal Witness, they now actually have a clock they can beat you with whenever they're taking their infinite turns. Cards like Noxious Revival, Snapcaster Mage, Regrowth, Eternal Witness, Academy Ruins, all of these cards give you redundant copies of other cards that go into your gifts piles. This idea of adding cards to your pile that let you get whatever you want is where gifts can be the most frustrating to play against. It is no longer a game of trying to get your opponent to fall for your mind games. It is now instead a double demonic tutor where your opponent has to decide between a bad choice and a worse choice. In Modern, we don't have access to that broken of a 2-card combo, or at least we don't have access to one that costs as little mana as Time Vault Voltaic Key. But we can still gifts for cards that replicate the there is no right answer pile. Against decks where mana is intensive and they have land-based combos, you can search for Life from the Loam, Raven's Crime, Ghost Quarter, and Tectonic Edge. And if destroying lands is not as big of a problem, and you instead want to focus on attacking their hand, well, maybe incidentally attacking their lands, we can just swap out Tectonic Edge for Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth. And this allows us to constantly keep putting lands in our hand, casting Raven's Crime to always be making them discard cards. Against aggressive decks or decks that rely mainly on low converted mana cost permanents, these would be things like the Urza decks. In some cases, this is you'd want to do the first pile for Tron, but against decks that are like Tron and have a lot of baubles or have a lot of low mana artifacts or just aggressive decks, the pile you usually search for is Life from the Loam, Academy Ruins, Engineered Explosives, and Batterskull. This pile will eventually, at least, not necessarily right away, but eventually you'll be able to recur Engineered Explosives every single turn. And considering that we're in a gifts deck, so we're 3 to 5 colors here, we can every turn spend maybe about 5 mana to blow up every single permanent that you're going to need. If it's a really low, like 1 mana cost permanent. And as it gets more and more mana intensive, you can blow up successively higher and higher CMC permanents. It also eventually, whenever they have a bad misdraw and they don't actually have anything you need to blow up, you just put Batterskull on top, and now you have a 4/4 Vigilance lifelinker that will allow you to win the game for you. Now, we can do this for hours, discussing gifts piles, and I'm sure there are some people that would love that. I could probably make a YouTube channel entirely of just talking about cool gifts piles and why they're so cool, but that isn't the video we're doing. We now understand the importance of the cards that we are not going to the graveyard, because we can then get them back. But what if we push that to its absolute limit? What if I can get none of the cards that I searched for? Now, you might be thinking, wait, what do you mean I can get none of the cards? Well, let's look back at gifts again, but we were looking at the Champions of Kamigawa version, and just like in Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon, formatting has kind of changed. In Yu-Gi-Oh! They've had problem-solving card text come out that clarifies the exact things that can happen. Magic is the same thing. There was an updated version of Gifts Ungiven released, and this is now the Oracle text of Gifts Ungiven. Search your library for up to 4 cards with different names and reveal them. Target opponent chooses 2 of those cards. Put the chosen cards into your graveyard and the rest into your hand, and shuffle your library. Up to 4 cards means that you can select less than 4. Now, why would you ever want to do that, though? Because if you pick 3 cards, your opponent still gets to choose 2. No matter how many you choose, they get to throw 2 of them away. And that means you only get 1 card out of it. And if you select lower than 3 cards, you just lose all of the cards you search for. So what's the benefit in that? Well, as cards like Buried Alive and Entomb have shown, sometimes just getting cards into the graveyards is a super valuable tool. Heck, Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! Both have highly playable versions of these similar cards. Foolish Burial is basically the same effect as Entomb, and Battle Compressor is more or less the same effect of Buried Alive, and both of them see a significant amount of play in their respective card games. So you might be questioning, okay, well, we're going to just throw away 2 cards then. But what 2 cards are we going to throw away here? The 2 cards that we're going to throw away are Burial Rites and literally whatever big creature your heart desires. While Burial Rites is in the graveyard, you can pay 3 and a white to cast it from your graveyard and return any creature in your graveyard to play. Gifts gives us a way with 1 card to set up Burial Rites with a reanimation target of our choice. The most common targets for Modern include Iona, Shield of Emeria, and Elesh Norn. Some spicier option includes things like Grave Titan and Dragonlord Silumgar. It's important to remember as we wrap up our focus on Gifts Ungiven that these are not mutually exclusive uses of gifts. You do not have to choose to only play gifts as a bomb searching tool, a land search, a value generator, a combo enabler, or a combo piece itself. Decks designed to use gifts optimally will have all of these pieces involved. So my next question is, where can we apply this information? In Magic, we have a couple of retrains, which is a term from Yu-Gi-Oh!, which means re-releases of cards with kind of fixed versions or made them more balanced. These retrains include Signal the Clans and Realms Uncharted. Both of them are doing the same type of idea. You're searching for specific cards and having your opponent choose, or in the case of Signal the Clans, you're having it randomly get choosed. The fact that Signal the Clans restricts you to 3 cards, and they have to be creatures, and you only get 1 of them, definitely makes it the lowest power level of the 4 that we kind of talked about here. Realms Uncharted costs 1 less mana than Gifts Ungiven, but restricts you only to lands. It still has the same, you can only search for 2 if you want to, but then you're just throwing 2 lands away. And that's significantly less powerful than throwing away the combo of Unburial Rites and a large creature. In Pokemon, my research has given me no trainer cards or Pokemon abilities that have an effect to this. If you know of one, though, please leave it down in the comments below, and I will happily take a look and make some adjustments to this if I need it. But the real comparison we want to is Painful Choice. Painful Choice was released in September 2002 with the Spell Ruler set. It was previously the Magic Ruler, but Yu-Gi-Oh! Had to change their Magic cards to Spell cards because of Magic the Gathering. And it was pretty much immediately recognized as a great card. Painful Choice is a spell card with the following text. Select 5 cards from your deck and reveal them to your opponent. Your opponent selects 1 card from among them, add that card to your hand, and discard the other cards. It is important to note that discard in this case does not trigger effects like Dark World or Danger Monsters. It is just they go to your graveyard. It's one of those, weird idiosyncrasies of how they actually explain the card text. Now, it was released in September 2002, and it was limited to 1 copy in October 2002, literally a month later. It was then banned 1 cycle afterwards, returned for 1 cycle at limited, and then was laid to rest in a ban list, where it has probably going to be staying for the rest of its days. This puts Painful Choice in a very exclusive group of cards that have been banned for closing in on 20 years. These include cards that I will likely discuss in later videos, including Pot of Greed, Graceful Charity, Fiber Jar, and Yatagarasu. It may not have been around long, but it was played in many of the top 8 decks in the 2003 World Champions. This includes 1 in the side deck of the winning player, which I will try my best. I believe it's Ungiven. If I did that incorrectly, I apologize. I could not find anywhere online on how to pronounce it correctly. This was in his Yadalok deck here. And it may have only been in the side deck, but there was quite a few copies in the top players of that tournament. Painful Choice is undoubtedly one of the most busted Yu-Gi-Oh cards ever printed. However, just like Gifts Ungiven, it can be a bit deceptive in its abilities. Going to our surface level analysis, we can see how this card might actually be worse than Gifts Ungiven or Intuition, considering you get less cards than Gifts, and you lose more cards than Intuition. Plus, with Intuition, if you search for 3 cards, you could guarantee you got the same one. With Painful Choice, you have to search for 5, and you're only allowed to have 3 of any copy of a card in Yu-Gi-Oh! So it may seem like this card is not nearly as good. However, I hope that I've helped you see that sometimes the value is not just in getting 1 card, but in losing other cards. Cards with flashback and recursion in Magic are one example of this. Another representative example is a card played in certain Pokemon decks, Acrobike. This card is basically the same as the Magic card Nagging Thoughts, and there's probably other examples of this too. Nagging Thoughts is just the first one that came to mind. But remember that in Pokemon, you don't need to spend any resources to cast your spells. Because Pokemon has a significantly higher card velocity than Yu-Gi-Oh! And Magic. That is that you get to play more cards per turn in Pokemon than in Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Magic. Acrobike tended to be used because of the fact that a card goes to your graveyard, as opposed to you're putting it back on the bottom of your deck or back in shuffled in. Ditching energy or Pokemon is a critical part of certain strategies, including decks like Honorstoise, which won energy and the titular Blastoise in the discard pile, so that way they could cast an Archie's H in the hole, return Blastoise to play without having to go through the full process of getting a stage 2, or Night March style decks, where your Pokemon get more powerful attacks for each discarded Pokemon. Vespiquen does not have Night March, it has Be Revenge, but it's a similar type effect, and it was popular in one of the World Championships, so I felt the need to include it here. Now, while the previously mentioned Battle Compressor is useful, remember, this would be used in addition to Battle Compressor. Acrobike shows up in these decks if they want an additional card that does it. Also because it's useful if you're going to be able to ditch an energy or a Pokemon while not having to go down on cards in hand. That is a useful side effect of this card. Painful Choice combines the best traits of both worlds. Like Pokemon, having a lack of a mana system means that Painful Choice can be fired off immediately. Unlike Pokemon, however, where Battle Compressor is a useful card in some strategies and does still see a decent amount of play, a weaker, more restricted version of it in Foolish Burial has been limited to 1 copy since March of 2010. Getting monsters in your graveyard in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is huge, from lower level plays of simply monster reborning them, to providing graveyard synergies like Mizuki in zombie decks, Glow Up Bulb in Synchro decks, or Necro Gardener as a defensive option. Some entire archetypes are built entirely around getting cards in the graveyard, and Foolish Burial still sees play today in numerous meta decks. Instead of simply thinking of Painful Choice as you get one card, think of it as your opponent chooses which card you don't get to Foolish Burial. Foolish Burialing 4 cards while not losing a card is a pretty insane play in modern day Yu-Gi-Oh! It also has the same flaw of Intuition, where you don't actually have to get cards that have different names. With this in mind, you can build a pile in numerous ways, such that you don't just get a good board. With 4 Foolish Burials and getting a card, you could just straight up win the game if your opponent doesn't have a hand trap or some other kind of interaction. I'll link some videos down below that will link to a couple of piles and explain the actual process. But piles such as Plague Spreader Zombie, Elemental Hero Shadow Mist, Jet Synchron, Glow Up Bulb, and literally any 5th card, you don't even need all 5 of the cards, can get you a win. Another option that I will link to is Infernity Avenger, Infernity Archfiend, Infernity Necromancer, Stygian Street Patrol, and a second Stygian Street Patrol. Both of these piles allow you to win on the first turn. If you just have Painful Choice in your hand, you can kill your opponent. Granted, most of these decks likely would not function well without them going first and executing their combo. The deck is built entirely around being able to win with a first turn Painful Choice, but simply allowing certain meta decks to get a free special summon or graveyard effect to trigger is absurd for a card that on the surface only has a +0 in card economy. To wrap this all back together, for many players, seeing a card that gives the opponent a choice is sometimes viewed as bad. In Magic especially, the idea of a Punisher card, where opponents choose between 2 seemingly bad options, is usually not very effective, as the opponent will always pick the one that is best for them at that given moment. Painful Choice and Gifts Ungiven help us see that the real way to break a card where opponents have some say in the outcome is to deny them that choice at all, making every option come out highly in your favor. Realizing when you can break parity on a card that seems balanced is a key idea in any CCG that can allow you to come out ahead and reward your creative deck building. In the same way that cards that hurt you for having monsters are good in decks without monsters, or preventing trap usage is great in a deck without traps, finding cards that benefit you in your hand or in your graveyard is what makes cards like Gifts Ungiven and Painful Choice into the powerhouses they are today. Even if Gifts is significantly less powerful, its history in the game shows the power of giving your opponent the illusion of choice. Painful Choice also clearly shows us that sometimes the value in a card is not purely in what you get from the card, but what you don't. This concludes our CCG case study, The Value of Losing Cards. If you like this video and want to see more, or if you have future ideas of card comparisons or video ideas, please leave them in the comments down below, drop a like or a subscription, and if that's not your thing, you can also follow me on Twitter at CCG Case Study. Thanks again for watching, everybody. This is Mox Diamond, and I hope to see you in my next lesson.